What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe show. As always, I'd like to say you're blessed, highly favored, a magnet for miracles, and a solution for someone's problem. And I am the winner of the 2018 Innovation Award given out by the Canadian Ethnic Media Association. And as I always like to say, I'm the host of Epic Conversations, and this is the place for Epic Conversation. Anyone who knows a little bit about the Dr. Vibe show, we always like having new friends on the Dr. Vibe show. And we have another one. So we keep on bringing new and outstanding people to the platform. And just love to have them share. This young lady, her name is Jordana Matlin. She's an assistant professor at the School of International Service at American University. Prior to that, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse. She's received her PhD in sociology from UC Berkeley. So she's traveled around a little bit. And we're going to have her share tonight about an article that really, really caught my interest: Black masculinity under racial capitalism. So we'd like to welcome for the first time, but hopefully not the last time, Ms. Jordana Matlin. How are you this evening?
I'm great, thank you.
Fantastic. And thank you for taking time out of your schedule, because I know you always have a lot of things going on. So I know you got a lot of busy stuff happening. Like we always do when we have new friends come on the Dr. Vibe show. Nice little short, tight bio, but can you just share a little bit about yourself, life growing up, the younger days before you became this powerhouse?
Oh, wow. Okay, well, thank you for the kind words, and just a little bit about myself. So, a lot of my biography actually reflects my research interests. I'm a professor, as you mentioned, and I grew up much of my life actually in Francophone West Africa, but
Yes.
also being an African American in the United States, and then a childhood in West Africa, and I moved back to the States. So actually, I was overseas before I was in the U.S., even though I'm American, and moved here when I was 8. And then my father was still in West Africa until I was a senior in high school. So a lot of my growing up has actually been traveling. And then as a young adult, also, I lived overseas. I've lived in 11 countries now. So
Wow.
I love seeing difference and seeing the commonalities in difference, and using the lens particularly of being somebody who has been racialized in different contexts has sparked my interest in understanding Blackness. And to be a little bit more explicit about that, in West Africa, the colonial history and the different geopolitics kind of put me on the side of the white binary. And then in the States, I've been unquestionably on the side of the Black binary. And so that's made me really kind of use my sociological thinking to understand the relationship between power and racialization.
Wow, that is amazing. 11 different countries, especially traveling when you were younger. Let me ask, what are your memories of growing up in Africa?
So, I think a lot of our memories, they change with what our parents tell us, and, especially early memories. So I'm not always sure about what I remember and what I project. I definitely recall, it was a pretty easy life. My parents were expatriates, and so it was a life of relative privilege there, and I loved it. I mean, I love the warmth. I was in Burkina Faso, and the warmth of the people are pretty famous. So I actually returned for the first time from my childhood with my mother when I was doing field work. And it was a wonderful place to be, very hot, but very nice. And then most of my time, so that was Burkina Faso, which is a landlocked country to the north of Cote d'Ivoire, which is where I do my field work. And that's where I kind of spent summers as a little bit older. And it was interesting. I went to a Baptist missionary boarding school as a day student because it was the one English speaking school. And so there was also kind of being immersed in an African country, but in a kind of small, like American, actually Canadian, and that's where I just got a little bit of playback there. But
No, you're good.
but yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot I could actually go into about that experience and the difference of kind of being an outsider looking in and being a little bit older and seeing a lot of the inequalities of the privileges that I was given. I love it there, but it was a place that it was much easier for me being an American than for the average Ivorian, and so it's hard for me to say easily that it was the most wonderful place in the world, because it was still very neo-colonial in a lot of ways, and there were a lot of inequalities if you were Ivorian. So and that created some tensions socially between locals and foreigners that were unfortunate.
You mentioned how you saw a lot of inequality. When did seeing that inequality become, I want to either study it or do something about the inequalities that I've seen and experienced in my life?
Sure. So, I'm not quite sure when I decided I wanted to specifically do something to work towards making those inequalities better. I mean, when I came to grad school, certainly it was because I wanted to understand the country better. There had been a civil war when I started graduate school. It had just erupted, actually, my first year in graduate school. And I was very struck by opening, actually, in another country I lived between my college and my graduate school. I was living in China for a year. And
Wow.
I received a Time magazine I think once a week, or I think it's a weekly magazine, right? And I had family friends who would send it to me in China. And I opened it one week and I saw my former school, the Baptist Missionary Boarding School, being evacuated by French soldiers, and these students sitting on a tank being evacuated. And so that made me want to understand the country. It was known the whole time I was living there as kind of the bastion of peace and prosperity. That's the way most journalistic accounts and academic accounts portray the country. Within the region, they were surrounded by civil war, a lot of poverty, and it was kind of the stable country. So it made me want to study it. And then once I got there and I started to do field work as an adult, I think that was when the things about the inequality really struck me. And, I mean, just a couple observations. One being that 50 years after colonialism ended, the best job that most people would look to have would be somebody working in the home of a foreigner, be a domestic or to be a security guard or things like that. And as I mentioned, there was a civil war going on when we were there. It was kind of in stasis, but you had a lot of army and police checkpoints in the city. And I was with a friend who worked for an aid organization, and she had taken a turn, an illegal turn, and was stopped by the police, who then proceeded to try to get a little bribe off of her, which was quite normal. And when she resisted, the next thing that he asked for was if she could get his niece a job. And so the form that the police were bribing was asking to help find work. And this is an economy where 75% of people in the city are working informally. And that's a way of saying they're unemployed, because there's no social safety net. There's no, healthcare. There's no welfare, nothing like that. If you're not working, you're not eating unless you have, family networks. And so that really struck me. And then the other level was just trying to make friends. That, so much of what kind of was underlaying relationships with people. And I did immerse myself in different communities that I was part of when I was in California in graduate school. So I like to, I was in a dance community. I don't know if you've heard of capoeira. It's
Yeah.
So I played capoeira and I was teaching when I was there. And it was very hard to just meet. I was teaching at a dance school, a professional dance school. And just to meet the dancers where they were was difficult because there was the overriding relationship of who has more and who has less. And within the kind of local system, there's an expectation that if you have more, you pay for everyone. And that's locally as well. I mean, it's the big man politics. And there was always this expectation that anytime we went out, I was the one paying. And it was just, I mean, it was just an expectation. It was, of course, you're the foreigner, you have more. But I don't think that it made for, I think it may have caused some resentment, if you're always, and again, this is 50 years after colonialism ended, and the people who were there, I mean, there just wasn't money, right? I mean, people were probably not eating, even these professional dancers were maybe eating one good meal a day. And these are people who really moved their bodies. And so how do you create friendships and relationships with this inequality hanging over and this expectation that anytime we go out, you're the one with that responsibility, which again, I mean, if I have more, it's fine. And certainly when I conducted interviews with men who were quite marginalized, I wanted to feed them, I mean, I would say, let's sit down, let's get a meal, because I knew that was often the only good meal they would get. But these were fellow dancers. These weren't people I was interviewing. These weren't, right? And there was still this relationship of inequality. And then, kind of transitioning into the things that I study with masculinity, I had mentioned the big man. There was this expectation that the big man, but what happens when it's a woman, right? Especially if those friends or those dancers are men, and then they go out with the woman and she's the only one who has the money to pay for that experience. So I felt that if this is something that makes me so uncomfortable, maybe it's worth studying. If it's that hard because of the politics, the geopolitics, the economic situation of being an American and being, an Ivoirian makes it so we can't meet each other halfway socially, then maybe there's something that I should try to understand a little bit better.
We'll get to the article in just a moment, but I just want to ask, was it difficult for you to adjust to America, coming back to America, because you had all these international travels?
I don't know if it's difficult, because it's all I've known for most of my life. I mentioned I moved to the States when I was 8. And then even then, I still had a parent who was living overseas. So I was returning every year. And so I think that, if anything, it's made it that I find the United States strange in ways that other people take for granted. And so things about popular culture, and the article touches on that, certainly, as does my scholarship. It's strange to me. I don't have a television in my home, and I didn't grow up with a television. So when I see music videos and I see these kinds of tropes being repeated about Black masculinity or relationships between men and women, my jaw's dropped. I think it's fascinating. And so I think that it's actually given me a lens that doesn't just accept it as normal and wants to actually untangle a little bit of this American culture that's so normalized for most Americans.
Okay, great. Well, let's get to the article. Of course, my first question is going to be, why did you write it?
So, I mean, it does reflect my larger research project, and I described a little bit of kind of the premise for that. As you would have picked up, I actually, if you call me an Africanist, my research is actually in West Africa and French West Africa. So I study French colonialism. But when I did my undergraduate degree, I was an urban studies major in New York. And one thing that made me start writing about the things that I write about in a kind of a transatlantic, or what Paul Gilroy calls a Black Atlantic, community or set of, peoples, is that a lot of the things that I learned about with the urban poverty, with issues in ghetto culture, things like that, and culture is a weird word to use. I don't know if I really want to use that word, but maybe sociality. There was this constant kind of crisis of Black masculinity, and so you see this in kind of some of the classic ethnographies. Elliot Liebau's Tally's Corner. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was published in response to the Moynihan Report in the late 60s. And there was this framing of Black men in crisis. And then I go and I start my field work in West Africa, and I didn't come to it as a gender scholar. I came to it more with an understanding of race and colonialism. But the more I started to read about African masculinities, unemployment, all of these things, it was the same. It was the same conversation across the Atlantic. That people were talking about with Black masculinity, and this constant narrative of crisis. So for me, I thought, well, maybe this has to do with the way Black men have been integrated into capitalism, and what I call in my article, this kind of tension between an assumption of patriarchal entitlement and Black negation. And so, yeah, that's kind of my motivation. And that article was an opportunity to reflect a little bit more on the American experience than my direct field work. But I certainly think that the things that I say, it resonates, right? I mean, I didn't have to refer to American, or I just could talk about Blackness, and it resonates across communities internationally of the Black experience.
You know what? I absolutely love the term you use, racial capitalism. Like that just like blew my mind.
Right.
And how you're saying it's not just an American thing. I live in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and I could fully relate to this article.
Sure.
Can fully relate to it, and I know that we could go on. Like there's so much I'd like to chat about. I know time is limited, but it caught my interest so much.
Sure.
And I do want to have you share about a few of the things. So I'm going to pull out some quotes from the article, and if you could expand on it a little bit. And this here, there's a quote in the article saying it's undeniable that our culture's obsession with branding cuts across race and gender. Nonetheless, there is something unique about Black men's participation in it, and that speaks to the location within the structure of racial capitalism. So what is your thought on what is a Black man's place in the world of racial capitalism?
Sure. So racial capitalism, I would love to take credit for that term, but I certainly cannot. It's a term that was arguably coined by Cedric Robinson in his book Black Marxism from 1983, although the term was used pretty consistently in at least from the 1970s for South Africans writing about the apartheid economy. So, racial capitalism basically asserts that that capitalism and racialism are co-constituted, that from the beginning, even from, early Europe, proto-racial formations were happening, for example, between the Irish and the English during the Industrial Revolution and the importation of labor. And then that traveled to slave economies. And it became very sedimented with Blackness becoming collapsed as an identity into the slave. And so from the beginning, even the idea of Blackness is and to be Black as opposed to what Cedric Robinson says to be African. To be Black is just a color, and it's a negation. So it's not a history, right? An African or an Ethiopian or an Igbo or a Swahili, or, whatever you want to, call it, it's just a color. And it says that there's no civilization, no nothing to it, right? So this is obviously a position of marginality, right? This position of utter negation to the point of questioning humanity. And then at the same time, from the beginning of capitalism, there was also patriarchy, right? So there, and feminist Marxists and feminist scholarship, that's a whole nother area of engaging capitalism, which I'm also part of those conversations. So this assumption that men's work was real work and what women did was not really work, with the wage economy, that the appropriate subjects of history, the appropriate workers, the appropriate change makers, history makers, are supposed to be men. And so these identities meet, right? And again, that goes to what I was saying about the crisis of Black masculinity, that from the beginning, how do you become a breadwinner and assume these kind of normative male roles if you're negated, if your labor power is constantly undervalued, right? And so what I try to look at in my working with racial capitalism and Black masculinity is to say, hang on, it's not just wage labor that actually makes you a participant in a capitalist economy. It's also through consuming, and it's through commodification, which is also the ways that the Black body entered the capitalist economy. Commodification being that Black people were property, right? Slaves were property and capital as well as workers, but also that the relationship to having things when they were themselves property has been historically denied, either because they weren't allowed to have things, or because they couldn't afford it, right? And so what I argue is that there's something particular about branding with Black men, the Black body, but Black men specifically, because there's this expectation you should be part of the capitalist economy. There's the inhibition, the prohibition from being part of it, but then there's these other ways that have been contentious as well. And so I argue that these are ways that actually become useful. And maybe you'll ask me actually about that. I don't know if I should stop talking if you're going to ask more questions.
I have a lot of questions to ask, and as I said, I almost think we may need to do a part 2 of this, but we'll see where we get.
Okay.
In the fact that Black men as commodities and consumers, that really struck me, and I, like I said, it really made me sit back and think that the only difference, maybe I'm wrong here in what you're thinking, but the only difference from now to hundreds of years ago is that the only thing that a lot of us were considered commodities. We're on top, we're consumers now, but we don't have any skin in the game per se, if you know what I'm talking, real power. We're contributing, or we're being taken advantage. How can I say? I don't know if it's taking advantage of, but I don't know if you know where I'm coming from, but we're still not part of the decision-making process. We're not a decision-making part of capitalism. It's only another thing that's been added, where consumers, we're still thought of as commodities, many of us, and we're just consumers. Like, how can I put it? Actually, maybe this is a good way, and I think it may be not any different now. One of the quotes in the article says, in the slave economy, the Black body was commodified both as labor to produce value and as capital, property itself. Blackness, in other words, was valued both as capital and subhuman capital generator. Do you feel anything's changed in 2019 from those days?
So I think that one of the important things to do when we make kind of like larger structural arguments, which I certainly do, is to recognize that things are different, and to understand how power is working in a new way, but using these same registers. So
Exactly.
things are different, and I certainly would never want to suggest that people don't have agency, right? I mean, people are making choices, and it's in fact a very empowering sense, and this is capitalism in general, right? To have things, to want things. So, there was somebody wrote this great op-ed a few months ago after Barack Obama had given a talk I think at one of the Black men events, Black masculinity events, and he, chastised Black men for dressing a certain way and purchasing certain things. And this person wrote in an op-ed saying, well, when I was at Harvard Law School, which is also where Barack Obama was, they also had the typical gold ring and gold necklace and gold chain from Cartier and whatever. So it's not that it's just Black people who do that, right? I mean, this is a dominant culture that's capitalist and very consumer oriented, and it's the way we find value in one another, which is often mediated by the things that we have, right? And that's where status comes from. So when I talk about, I use the framework of hegemony from Gramsci, and so I mentioned that in the article, what Gramsci talks about, and he talks about consent. So it's not just about, capitalism doesn't just work through coercion, through whipping people into submission, but making people want things and making people feel worthy. And so I try to understand how these registers of worth make people want things even when they themselves are marginalized and excluded, right? And so structurally, Black people are excluded, right? And there's a lot that has to do, it has in common with early capitalism and even with the slave economy, although certainly manumission, right? That's important, that we're not literally slaves anymore. But individuals have a sense that they can escape it through, even if it's not a structural change, there's an individual sense that if I have a little bit of money, it's my way out, right? And that's certainly the American dream, probably the Canadian dream, the capitalist dream, is you can get out of it. So what I try to argue also, though, is specific about Blackness is that, in kind of this new economy, an economy that we talk about, contingent work, gig economies, post-work, right? Flexible labor, where people don't have the same, careers and salary jobs as before. There's a new model that really prizes entrepreneurs and consumers, that the way to be a citizen in your country is by being a consumer citizen, right? You're a homeowner, and that's how you are able to have a stake in your community. We glorify entrepreneurs, right? Entrepreneurs are like the new ideal, and certainly within Black communities, there's a huge prizing on entrepreneurship. And what I try to point out is that these ideas are actually, that's the only way Black, and I'm talking about specifically Black men because of this expectation of being, right, breadwinners. That's the only way historically that they were actually able to succeed, was by being entrepreneurs, because they were shut out, right? And by being performers, which this whole commodities and branding, right, and kind of being showcased, they couldn't get good working jobs. If they got, working jobs, they were considered, they were devalued, they were underpaid. The harder they worked, the more they were told that they were brutes, right? And so it was actually always being outside of the kind of like dominant economy that Black men were able to make it. And now this is kind of the new model of success, is being outside. And so what I try to say is this kind of, the Black men kind of prefigure the new economy because of the way they were able to make it. And then with the branding, specifically the commodities, and I start my article with the Hank Willis Thomas, that very powerful image branded head, that there is really a continuity of, structurally, Nike is still owned by white corporations.
Of course.
the way to, and all of these, right? We don't have to just pick on Nike, but there's this sense that if I have a brand now, if I bought into it, now I'm winning the game. And I just want to question, how are you winning the game if your money is still going to the white corporation, right? So that I don't see how that's changing anything. And then if we want to think about it globally, which my work likes to think about it globally, there's a lot of brown people being really exploited by Nike, right? And so, and again, I'm picking on Nike, but this is capitalism. So how are we freeing ourselves from racial capitalism if our practices are not only contributing our money to the dominant structures that have oppressed us in the new form in 2019 versus 1719 or 1819, but we're also oppressing people who have a lot in common with us structurally from the way we've been excluded and exploited in another part of the world, right? And so I try to think about not that it's the same, but how is exploitation perpetuating in ways that are similar, but with new forms, right?
Yeah, it's same story, different look.
Sure.
So it's different, a different look, and it's really interesting that for many Black men, working for a company can be the most exhausting, not only physically, but mentally and emotionally thing you can do. And as you said, yes, for historically, Black men have done best when they become entrepreneurs. But entrepreneurism isn't an easy game either.
Sure.
It's very, very tough, but it's the only alternative. And I know you brought up Nike, and you made reference to Colin Kaepernick.
Sure.
In your article, and leading to that, and I guess more of a recent example. And if you're comfortable, I'd love to give your thoughts about the whole Jay-Z NFL, if you have any comments on that, because I think actually I've had a number of conversations about that, and I would love to get your thoughts on that, because racial capitalism definitely comes in that dynamic, and I think it's a real live example, and people are still talking about it on, did he sell out, etc. What are your thoughts on that one?
So, I'm actually going to defer that question to another Hank Willis Thomas image. He's a wonderful artist, by the way, and if you haven't looked at his body of work, you really should. But there's an image of a football player, a linebacker, I believe, and actually maybe not a linebacker. I'm not super versed in American football or European football, to be fair. But he is bent down in kind of a position to throw the ball behind him, and he's wearing his football uniform, his jersey and everything, his helmet. And he's on a field, it's got the green lines and everything. And then opposite from him, bent down in the same position, is basically a slave picking cotton. And so they're facing off of each other, and the line, cuts. So you see a football field on one side and a cotton field on the other side. And they're both bent down, right? The NFL, the way it brutalizes bodies are just the brain damage that comes from it, that affects life expectancy. I mean, these men are modern day gladiators. Many men who finish careers in the NFL, they haven't been properly trained in how to save their money, what to do, unless they're incredibly charismatic. There's not necessarily a career, from using their football and broadcasting or whatever. So these are disposable bodies. And the NFL, it's shameful in a lot of ways. So let's even just before we even get to Jay-Z, right? So if you're backing an institution, if you want to call it a sport or just an institution that brutalizes bodies and then disposes of them, I'm already questioning that. And then given the way, I mean, I have a lot of love for Colin Kaepernick. I'm critical of Nike, and I'm critical of the conversation that just took Nike using him as kind of a promotional device, and then saying we won, right? Because we didn't win. We're still the things that Colin Kaepernick was fighting for and choosing not to play for, or to be expelled for. Nothing has changed, right?
Yes, he still isn't playing.
And exactly, he's still blacklisted. And Black lives still don't matter in the dominant, right? Dominant conversation. So Jay-Z, with the power that he has, he definitely doesn't need the money, right? The first billionaire. And for people like that, because of the power of the mass media, I mean, he has much more of a voice. I'm so happy to be on your show. Jay-Z has a louder voice than I do, and being on your show isn't going to change much of that. He has a platform, and he could really change minds because, and then again, this is coming from Gramsci's idea of hegemony, this idea of creating these common sense ideas of what is resistance, what is, and I'd say Beyonce and Jay-Z being kind of a first family of blackness, a first Black family in royal family in our generation. There is an assumption that they are winning the game, and therefore they're standing up for all Black people and all Black problems, right? And whether or not that's true, and it's not true, right? But there is kind of what I would call a popular consciousness, a common sense, Gramsci would say, understanding that when Beyonce, plays in the Super Bowl and she sings Formation, that whatever she's singing about Givenchy and rock necklaces and paper and whatever, that is resistance. And to, if we want to call it the man or what, that's resistance. When that, to me, that's racial capitalism, right? In its own manifestation. And so the power that they have to speak up against oppression and how they're using it are two very different things. And certainly, I wouldn't be the first person, if we're going to pick on Beyonce, to point out with Ivy Park, using labor from, undervalued women who in very exploitative conditions, and then talking about Black feminism. And when you're exploiting brown women, right, that's not Black feminism. But interestingly, her feminism is appropriating a lot of the same tropes of this Black masculinity that I'm critiquing.
Right.
So it's kind of, I don't know if you've heard the conversation about lean-in feminism, but it's kind of a lean-in feminism for Black women, of let's just be like the men in all the ways that are problematic about capitalism, and just, I'll be the next Bill Gates, basically. And Jay-Z is absolutely right next to her, right? I mean, his music video, and again, my popular culture is unfortunately limited. I'm already the one where they're in, is it in Paris and in the museum where they're looking at all of these paintings? Do you remember the name of the song?
Don't remember the name of the song. I'll be transparent, just like you. I don't watch a lot of videos because just personally, they portray an unrealistic,
Sure.
not great image of who we need to be.
Sure.
Who we need to be. I think, I'll just aside here, I think music died once videos came into prominence. I'll just leave it at that. That's a Dr. Vibe thing. I hear what you're saying in that the imagery, it is racial capitalism. It's painting a picture of something that at the end of the day is really not meant to be for us.
Sure.
I'll leave it at that.
Sure. And it's appropriating it and saying that we've won, right? Because we've appropriated it. But again, structurally, we haven't. And an individual appropriating it doesn't change the structural issues. And the fact that, I certainly have a more Marxist take on critiques of capitalism. but it's a system that's problematic. It's a system that is based on inequality and based on exploitation. Somewhere down the line, that toxic waste that's, you know, spills off into the rivers is going to poison someone and creating those clothes. Somewhere down the line, you know, in mining for the computer that, you know, we're speaking through now, somebody is being exposed to something and certainly underpaid. So the music video, I do want to at least acknowledge what the name is if I'm gonna critique it. I am a researcher. It's ape s star t, or star t. But it's just an example. One of the lines is something about how, you know, my generations and generations and generations after me of my progeny are going to be, you know, basically filthy rich. And what I'd like to say is, you know, what's the earth going to look like? What's climate change going to look like? All of these things for those generations. How many species are still going to be around to enjoy? You might be really rich in your citadel, but the planet will be much less diverse and beautiful place to be for them to inhabit if we keep going this route, right? So as far as Jay-Z and you know, I picked on Beyonce too, but I think that the two of them and certainly Jay-Z with the NFL, I agree with the critics. You know, whether or not he's selling out, I don't even think it's about necessarily selling out. I think it's about his just attitude is first and foremost about profit, right? I mean, he's a capitalist, and it's first and foremost about profit. And the fact that he's a capitalist and he's a black man, he's still a capitalist in ways that I'm critical of.
And I told you we need to do a part two. Hopefully one day we'll do a part two. But another line in your great article that you have said that really just hit me is, within the world capitalist system, black men are, well, you said were, but it sounds like you feel are, cast in three distinct but imbricated roles: commodified bodies, devalued laborers, and fraught consumers. Now, you made that statement in the past, but do you feel that it's any different today?
So one thing, you know, my area of research, and I mentioned, you know, the informal economy in Abidjan, the city where I do my fieldwork in West Africa. It's got 75%, you know, informal, which is another way of saying unemployed. With the post-industrial moment, when, you know, in the 1970s, industry went to China and went to other places, and, you know, the economy changed to a more service-oriented economy. That was also the moment when there started to be gains in Black communities. You know, you pass the Civil Rights Act, you say that you can't discriminate in the workforce. And so what we're seeing now is a moment of exclusion and not so much actually exploitation for Black men. So there's a quite important post-colonial scholar, African scholar named Achille Bembe, who caused this kind of like moment of increasing unemployment, the becoming Black of the world, because it was an experience that Black people had of this insecurity, this economic insecurity first. But he also talks about what kind of, and him and other people, of what kind of role do Black men have or Black people have if they're not even desired to be exploited by a global capitalist system and they become surplus and then literally disposable. And so one of the biggest areas of study that people have had in the United States since the post-industrial economy, and there have been several people, Michelle Alexander, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, the prison industrial complex, right? There's a sociologist, Loic Lacan, who says that this is a warehouse. Prisons are warehouses for the labor that used to be held in the ghetto. Like the ghetto used to be a place to extract labor for, you know, for contingent work, and now it's disposable and it's put in, which also is a source of labor, right? Prisons, but it's so there is a difference in that instead of being devalued now vis-a-vis, because of course Black men are always valuable, but vis-a-vis the formal global capitalist economy, there is a shift away from even being exploitable and now being excludable. And that is a very scary thing.
Wow. That's a powerful statement you made there. Black men are not avoidable now, they're also excludable. That's very powerful. That and but has it always hasn't it in many ways, don't you think it's in a lot of ways it's always been that way?
I mean, so again, slaves were valuable. They were extremely valuable. And when you need people to work for you, but you devalue them, that's different from saying, there's and again, I study Africa. I'm an Africanist, but
Sure.
African land is very valuable, right?
Yeah.
The mines, the minerals, the resources, the oil, very, very valuable. But to the global capitalist economy, there's not a lot of interest in Black workers. And even the big, the new discovery of Africa by China. The global capitalist economy, I just had a little blowback. So Chinese capitalists coming in and exploiting Africa today, which is kind of the big thing.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
They're often bringing their own workers. It's a way for them to export also, a surplus population of their own and to colonize in effect. And they have separate labor camps, so they don't have to mix with the local population. They're I mean, in many, I'm
so
sure.
they're bringing their own workers and using them over the inhabitants of the region.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
So, it's possible that not Africa is a big continent and there's a lot of things going on with China and Africa, but certainly the systems that I have read about and studied, that's exactly what's happening. And they live in segregated residential camps. They don't, and there's just not even a lot of mixing. Which, that's not that different from the colonial settler city of Europeans. But what the point that I'm making is that Africans are, for global capital, largely disposable. People, I have friends and I've met scholars who do some really interesting work of looking at how even within formal economy, that becomes a way for global capital to save money. So for example, mobile phone companies, one of the biggest things is mobile phones in Africa. I have a friend named Hannah Schilling who's based in Berlin doing her PhD, and she's looked at how the people who sell phone recharges, because you don't have phone plans, you have kind of recharge cards, that this is actually a really good way for Orange or, all of these large companies to save money, is to get these informal workers to do it. So it's not that, there's no linkages at all, but compared to the size of the populations, it's a drop in the well. And then again, for Black men, and we'll just take the example of the United States, because I'm in the U.S. With prison populations. If we counted prison populations among in our unemployment rates, right, we would have much higher rates of unemployment. And there's many good economists who say that we should be counting prison populations in our unemployment rates, because why are these people, obviously the drug economy was a big one, but why were people petty drug dealers for an entire generation, right? So you involve yourself in the informal economy because you lack opportunities. So whether or not quite literally these people lived or died would not actually impact these major corporations. Whereas in a former era, that labor was actually valuable, right? It was something that was useful. Whether or not it was, working on a plantation or as a sharecropper or in, industry and in the worst jobs, the lowest skilled jobs, it was still valuable labor, but our economy has shifted.
Wow. And our time's beginning to run out so fast. And again, we just touched this, but let me ask you what, I guess, a two-part conversation piece. First of all, what effect has racial capitalism having on today's state of Black masculinity? And then I guess also, what do you think the state of Black masculinity is today?
Oh, wow. Okay, so those are racial capitalism. I mean, I think it's so racial capitalism being right, this idea that all capitalism, to take from Cedric Robinson, all capitalism is racial capitalism, right? So it always was racial. And so I would say the facts are, what I stated in the article about this fraught relationship between these assumptions of patriarchy, and yet a negation. And again, this is a structural thing, because there are certainly Black men who are doing great, who have, good jobs and they're wage employees, not necessarily entrepreneurs or football players right, but just, salaried workers like the rest of us. But structurally, when you look at them, like, what Black men are more likely to be excluded, you still have, this negation. And what I kind of laid out as far as finding value through being consumers, because this was historically something denied, but also using that commodification and what I argue, vis-a-vis the globe, Black men being kind of these tropes of American capitalism, in a way. That they actually are exportable images that stand in for coolness, for even because of, victories such as, I'm right now in the process of writing my book, and I was just revising this section that talks about the Black Panthers and how the successes of the Black Panthers on the visual register, on the aesthetic register, has actually absorbed them into the iconography of like an edgy, cool capitalism. So even the very gains in representation that were made make Blackness very attractive to symbolize rebellion, but in a way that's very deceptive, right? And so what I would say is, and certainly being in West Africa, I mean, people thought it was the coolest thing in the world that I was a Black American, and they wanted, I mean, people all over, you see it in Thailand, you see it in Japan, you see it in Colombia, you see it, people like this idea of being cool and, being both what I write about elsewhere of being hegemonic and counter-hegemonic, that you have this identity that's both like this superpower, but also a, rejected and negated within, and that history of slavery. And we can say not just in the United States, but in the African diaspora, right? Populations who were exported and then found homelands. They're part of the West, but they're also the kind of like counter modernity, right? And again, Paul Gilroy talks about that in his book Black Atlantic, which is a classic book. So I would say that, yeah, this idea, those three identities that I outlined, right? That's the effect of racial capitalism on Black men today. Is symbolically they're very powerful, right, and very well received, but structurally they're excluded. And then there was a second question that you asked.
Actually, and because you're dropping, as we say on the Dr. Vibe show, knowledge bombs. you're dropping some serious knowledge bombs. So, I guess the state. Well, okay. The second question, I'm gonna just parking lot for a second. What I'm gonna ask you then is, what effect is this racial capitalism and black men having? What effect is it having on black culture? Black, I use the culture. So I'll say the black environment. Let me put it that way. What effect is this having on the black environment? So that's not only black men, but black women, black families, black communities, etc. What effect is this having, in your opinion?
So, I mean, when I did my field work, talking to men, every single one of them who was Ivoirian, and then there's a whole immigration issue there that I won't go into. That was the trigger for the Civil War, actually. But the far majority of men, let's just say I spoke to, were unmarried, and they ranged in age to the oldest I interviewed for the purposes of my study were in their 40s, mid to late 40s, and every single one unmarried. And every single one had the exact same thing to say. In French, it was "Je n'ai pas les moyens," which means I don't have the means. And so what that means for Black women, because they're still having babies, right, is it was easier for the men, and in that, and more of in the Ivoirian or the African, and of course Africa is very, very big and diverse, but there is a sense across a lot of African societies that to marry, to be a social elder is to marry and to have children, right? That's kind of a marker of adult masculinity, as some theorists have called it. And there's expectations with that. And if you are a man who works in the informal economy, the way you can, it maybe today, maybe not tomorrow. Maybe I'll have a little bit of money today, maybe I won't have money tomorrow. You're not really a father unless you are a legitimate father, unless you marry. And so if you're not a legitimate father and you help pay school fees, you're a really nice guy who's doing something he doesn't have to do. If you marry a woman, there's expectations from her parents, there's expectations, and you don't bring home enough money to pay for the school fees every month, you're a failed father. And so for men's sense of dignity, what do? They don't get married, right? Je n'ai pas le moyen. Why would I complicate things, they say, So I would much rather be a nice guy who's doing what I don't have to do, and every 3 months giving my partner a little bit of money, than to legally marry and then be a failure 2 out of 3 months, right? And so that is, maybe a more exaggerated lens of similar things that are happening across the Atlantic, right? Because of these more rigid categories of adult men and fatherhood and stuff. But again, you see a lot of the same conversations about not marrying, about, people having this kind of disconnect from one another. And so the women are carrying a lot of a burden from that. And certainly, the classic, and Patricia Hill Collins has talked about this in addition to other Black feminists. But for the first wave of white feminism, women wanted to be freed from the family, right? And then they wanted to work and they wanted to be in the public sphere. And Black women were like, hang on, I have been freed from my family ever since I was shipped, right, on a boat in the Middle Passage, and my children are sold willy-nilly. I want to be connected to my family. Don't free me from my family. And as far as having labor in the public sphere and being wage laborers and being freed to work, I've been working in your home this entire time, right? So Black femininity was always one that, and of course the classic "ain't I a woman," right? Of I have carried, the burdens as any man in the field, and then born the babies. But so a lot of these norms about breadwinning and things like that, there becomes actually a new burden of how do I prove that I'm really a man by appropriating. And even the Moynihan report said that black women were matriarchal, and that was the problem, was they were emasculating black men, right? So trying to have this normative division of reproductive, of sexual labor, where women are supposed to be domestic and in the home and men are supposed to work, that's never been what black families look like. And so when you're thinking about the effects on black communities, there's certainly, right, there's a disconnect, there's the aspiring to be like something, there's for women as well, the not fitting these classically feminine roles of capitalist femininity.
You know what? In the last 10 minutes, there's a whole other conversation on what you just shared, because just a little aside, that many a study shows that with black women in North America, the number one thing they're looking for in a mate is financial stability.
Sure.
And so that's a whole other conversation, but I'm glad that you brought light into that, and with racial capitalism and how it affects the black man, that just makes it even more challenging in regards to relationships between black men and black women. Agreed?
Sure, absolutely. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I've kept you on longer than you expected, so I don't want to have you on for too long, but too much longer. But what, as much as possible, I'd like to see if you have any solutions. What sort of, how can I say, call to actions can we do, or the blacks do, to get out of this racial capitalism bubble?
So, I mean, it's powerful. And as I mentioned before, that it's not just black people who are in it, right? I mean, this is the society we live in, and the way worth is valued, right? But I certainly take inspiration from the movements that were doubly, and again, the Black radical tradition that Cedric Robinson invokes in Black Marxism, but this doubleness, and certainly W.E.B. Du Bois, especially nearing the end of his life, Martin Luther King nearing, well, Du Bois much longer, but King nearing the end of his life. And of course, his last struggle was with the garbage workers strike, right? And really looking at poverty and work. But the doubleness of the anti-racist and anti-capitalist movement, right? Of how do we articulate this as a singular movement and not fracture that struggle, which is what I in my theoretical work, I argue is that this is a moment where Blackness is actually used as, again, a common sense, a hegemonic idea of in the interest of capitalism. That by having Black incorporation into capitalism, Black economic success, that becomes the way of winning the system, when in fact we need to be struggling against the system, and it is literally killing us. I mean, now this model of, consumer citizenship, of disposable consumerism, that is literally killing us. And we had, this just a week ago, these climate marches with the youth, which are incredibly important. And so how can we recover that oppositional stance of Blackness and not use it as a cover, right? As a cover for promoting brands, for promoting exploitations, but with a Black face that makes it look somehow oppositional, when in fact it's equally problematic. But people don't question it because the message is coming from a Black mouth or a Black body. So that's certainly my solution is, how can we recover that oppositional potential that all of the degradations in capitalism against the Black body have positioned it to so well speak against, right? And in a different essay, Paul Gilroy talks about this. He says that, you know, the Black body, having been a commodity for, you know, from inception, is in the best position to critique the commodity form. So how can we use that history to critique as well? And Greg Tate actually talks about that too. I think I quote him in my article as well, by saying we have to divest from these performances of Blackness if we want true Black liberation.
Well, excellent. One more quick question. What has the response to the article been?
I mean, you know, I don't often write for a public audience, and I've been accused more than once from both editors and my students of being a little bit difficult to follow, that I like to speak on a theoretical plane. So it was really nice having a reception from, you know, from you. I had a man who was a marriage counselor in California say, look, Black marriage counselor, this really impacted me, and I would love to have a conversation. I had a former student say to me that, you know, among his friends, he was really, well, for one, that made him feel a little bit guilty about what his graduation present was of a pair of shoes. But that, you know, that this was really something that hit home, and it hit home to his friends as well, as kind of articulating things that he sees and perhaps hasn't questioned, right? Because it is so much like a normal way of a common sense way of understanding resistance, by seeing like Jay-Z's my man, right? And he's speaking for me. So that's been nice of, you know, when you speak and you're not only speaking to your small circle of intellectuals. It's really nice. So it was also a good experience for me to try to communicate with more people and to have this opportunity, because it's easy for me to be lost in my books. The book that I'm reading right now, that I'm teaching on Wednesday. Nice. So it's very easy to get lost in this stuff, which, I mean, maybe more of us should get lost in this stuff. But the act of translation is also important. So.
Well, I'd like to say thank you for taking the time in your positive, productive schedule to share with our audience tonight. And I hope you can make some time to come back, because there's a whole pile of stuff I'd like to have you drop knowledge bombs on, because you were absolutely fantastic. There's so many things you've just, my mind is twirling right now, which is a wonderful thing, but I want you to get some rest. And especially, I know it's been a long day for you. So if people want to reach out to you, is there any way they can contact you or?
Oh, absolutely. Send me an email. I have a website, and as academics, when I was on the job market, I was highly encouraged to have a website. So it's quite a normal thing for us professors. And I have I have my american.edu, JC Matlon at american.edu. You can definitely send me professionally my email, or there's JC Matlin on Gmail. I think they might both be listed. And yeah, no, I love having conversations, and it also, I'm writing my book right now. I'm finishing up my revisions before I send it to presses. And so these are great ways that I can help think about what I'm saying and how to word things better. So I appreciate the opportunity, and for people reaching out, you're helping me as well. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, when the book comes out, please think about coming back.
I would be honored.
Yeah. We're honored to have you. It is the Dr. Vibe Show, and also on the replay with the posts, I will give all of Jordana's contact information, email, website, etc. It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe Show, the home of Epic Conversations. I'm the host of Epic Conversations. I'm the 2018 award winner in Innovation Wise, given by the Canadian Ethnic Media Association. If you want to find out more information about me, the best place to do is do is best thing to do is to go to my website, the drvibeshow.com. Coming up on when, if you're watching this live, it's September 30th. Coming up on October 2nd, we have David Miller talking about parenting Black children, and it's coming from a Black man's perspective. He's an outstanding father, but we're going to get a Black man's perspective, Black American man's perspective of parenting Black children. As always, I like to close it out saying, live your life as a dream. If you can dream it, you can make it. Sometimes you have to get smaller to get stronger. Block assumptions. And finally, aim bigger, aim better, aim higher, aim wider. I'd like to thank everyone who's watching this live or on the replay. It's appreciated, not taken for granted. Some people, I know Taj Cosmetics, Melvin Lars, a few other people, Eva Lara Coaching, or watching this and others. If I didn't give your name, it's because of my head, not my heart. God bless. Peace be all. Keep the faith, and we'll chat soon. Walk good. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.